when California becomes a state, gold is discovered. So there are settlers and prospectors, and then also railroads being built. So there are people from all over. There are lots of immigrants from all over, like Europe as well as Asia, who are kind of building and prospecting and settling in this new city. And they're all downtown on top of each other.
This is Five Places, Los Angeles, a living documentary of the city produced by the LA Forum for Architecture and Urban Design. I'm Emmanuelle Bourlier, and in each episode, I ask one interviewee about the 5 places that define Los Angeles for them. Today, my guest is the brilliant Yolande Daniels, Associate Professor in Architecture at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She is a recipient of the Rome Prize in Architecture and a fellow of the Independent Study Program of the Whitney American Museum of Art. Daniels' practice combines independent design research and architecture in studioSUMO, which she co-founded in 1995. Daniels' work explores the effects of race and gender in the built environment by revealing spatial narratives of resistance and autonomy. Taking the form of writing and design research, this work has been published and exhibited widely, including in the recent anthology, In Search of African American Space, Redressing Racism, and in the 12th, 14th, 16th, and 18th Venice Biennale Architecture Exhibitions. Recently, her project Black City, the Los Angeles edition, was featured in the exhibition Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Along with her fellow Reconstructions exhibitors, she is a co-founding member of the Black Reconstruction Collective. This is an evergreen conversation focusing on Yolande's Los Angeles-based research. We recorded in 2021 when Yolande was living in LA before moving to teach at MIT, and shortly before the opening of her show at the MoMA. Before we drop in, I'd like to share a note from Yolande's statement on her MoMA exhibition that struck me powerfully. Quote, "As I started to do research, the narratives that I found had to do with the agency of the inhabitants and how they built community, focusing on their power to shape the spaces around them. African Americans are often made to feel that we have no history, or that our history is only sorrow. But the people who were making the history, they were fighting all the time to realize good things for themselves and for their family and for others. That's what I see in these stories, and I want others to see them too." End quote. Here's my conversation with Yolande.
I mean, I'm from New York. I was born there, but I'm very comfortable here. Like, to me, it seems it's different. It's different, but it's on the same plane. And so I can kind of relate to it on the same plane, I feel, even though everything is different. The part that I am not really experiencing right now is how things are so spread out. And, my impression of the lifestyle here is that you connect the dots, between, your people, your favorite places. It's not in one kind of central area. Like, I think New York is more like that. Although now that people go to Brooklyn and Queens and, Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, Manhattan, they're a little more, there's more parity between them than there had been in the past. But still, I think people tend to be within a center, like whatever that center is, as opposed to the dots.
That's true in my experience. I'm interested that you said you find New York and LA to be on the same plane. What do you mean by that exactly?
Well, they're, I guess, like, they both are cities that they have an aura about them. Like they kind of, there's a city that you live in, and then there's the city that, I don't know, like the city that people think about what the city is, and those aren't necessarily the same thing. And in that respect, they're both kind of global cities, although in very different ways. The way the space they take up in people's mind is kind of similar, I think. Yeah.
That's so true. They're both mythical in a way.
Yeah, mythical. That's the word, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Totally different myths, but
Yes, yes, exactly. I feel so lucky to have lived in both.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I am happy. I never thought about moving here until, I did, but so it wasn't like it was something I was planning for a long time or anything. But I think I was meant to come here. Like it's it's really interesting. Definitely in terms of the work that I'm doing, it made me look at what I'm doing in a different way. And maybe it's partly just transplanting myself. Like in New York, I know New York, so maybe I didn't look at it so carefully as when I came here. And because it's so foreign, I had to look more carefully, perhaps, than I had in New York.
That's so true, because when we're in a new city, we pay much closer attention.
Yeah.
So maybe we should dive into the questions if you're ready.
Okay. Sure.
Okay. The first question is, how long have you lived in LA?
So I moved here in August 2019.
And what is it that brought you here?
I came here, well, I teach at USC, so I was offered a teaching position, and then just circumstances in my life and the teaching position, it seemed like a good time to come. And then my experience with Los Angeles when I was young was this summer staying with my godparents, who were very religious. They were Pentecostals, and we went to tent revivals the whole summer. So I was not very happy. I was just in church all the time.
Wow.
So I could really see the city.
That's an unusual way to experience LA as a
Yeah,
child, I would think.
it was very unusual. I saw a lot of the underside of tents. Yeah. Um,
Um, so I'd love to just dive in and ask you about the 5 places that define the city for you.
so I felt somewhat hesitant to do this because I am new here and I don't have the 5 places that are like the most meaningful to me, but I have been researching historic places in Los Angeles and I can talk about 5 of those. So I thought that's how I would approach it. I thought I would choose 5 places that are related to each other in some way and that are like places that I researched for this exhibition that I've been working on that opens at the Museum of Modern Art on Saturday. It's called Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America. And I was one of 10 people invited to study architecture and Blackness in a specific city. And I chose Los Angeles as the city. And what I've been looking at in Los Angeles are, well, it's been traces of Black settlement in Los Angeles. And I started looking at the Spanish conquest and the settlers, and then through like Mexican occupation and American occupation. And so basically I start with downtown, and I guess I could start with the most maybe prominent site, which is Biddy Mason Place, which was a public memorial by Power of Place. That's Dolores Hayden, Sheila Levrant de Bretteville, Betty Saar. It's behind a parking lot in between 3rd and 4th Street. It's very close to Grand Street Market? Grand Market?
Oh, Grand Central Market?
Yeah, Grand Central
Yeah.
Market. So it's behind, it's across the street and then behind the building that faces the market. And it's actually a very pretty court. There's an Italian restaurant, and you kind of walk by as if you're entering the Italian restaurant, and there's some trees where you can sit, and you keep going toward the parking lot. And in between the back of the restaurant, in the back of a parking lot, there's this kind of alley that is designated as Biddy Mason Place. And there's I don't think it's concrete. I think it's a more dressed up stone surface, but a gray stone surface that isn't a series of vignettes of her life. So Biddy Mason is interesting because she comes to Los Angeles from Utah, a slave with a Mormon family. She walks with the wagon train from Utah to Los Angeles, and they actually they end up in San Bernardino. And so they're in San Bernardino, which is a Mormon farming community. The Mormons founded the city, at least the American version of the city. And what was unique about San Bernardino is there were freedmen and women, and there were slaves, and they kind of worked on the farms in San Bernardino. And so, long story short, Biddy Mason's owner, they worked there for some time, and he decides he's going to move to Texas, move his homestead to Texas, where the enslaved people would basically, in Los Angeles, even though it didn't have slavery, if you came to Los Angeles with slaves, you could keep them. However, there was kind of the understanding that over time, if they were there long enough, they could petition for their freedom. And so I guess it had gotten to the point where it was long enough, and the owner decided, rather than give them freedom or deal with that he would move to Texas. Or at least that's one kind of line of thinking about. That's what the judge surmised in the case.
Mm-hmm.
So at the time, Black people were not allowed to speak in court, but through a series of events, the judge spoke directly to Biddy Mason and asked if she wanted to, go with the family to Texas.
Mm-hmm.
Owner's story was that, these are not my slaves, they're my family. And I guess she must have said no, because then the judge ruled in her favor and granted her and a total of 13 people who were like her children, another woman and her children, freedom. And the woman and her children, I don't remember her name, they stayed in San Bernardino, and Biddy Mason moved to Los Angeles. Also, part of this story is that in San Bernardino, there was a woman named Lizzie Flake, who was a free woman who had been a slave but bought her freedom. Mm-hmm. And another freed person, Robert Owens, who also bought his freedom, who was a kind of like a wrangler or something in Los Angeles. And so Biddy Mason moved to Los Angeles and lived with Robert Owens' family, his wife, his children. So that's how she gets to Los Angeles. She is a midwife, and she gives birth to both Black and white babies, but it's not a very big town, so she basically gives birth to everyone. And she becomes a kind of endeared person in society. She saves her money, and she starts to buy property. Robert Owen also, she's kind of, living with him and advised by him and others. He's a person who's buying property in downtown Los Angeles. So the two families, the Mason family and the Owens family, end up owning quite a bit of property downtown. And then Biddy Mason's daughter marries Robert Owens' son. And so it's like this kind of, they just pool their resources together, I guess. So another location is Brick Block. Brick Block was a neighborhood that was on First Street. It was kind of focused on around San Pedro, Los Angeles, and First Street, but it spread further. And Brick Block had a concentration of African-American businesses. Some of the businesses included a grocery store, furniture stores, a coffee shop, a barber shop, and there was a 2-story hotel with a restaurant. So in my project, looking at these, I kind of use Sanborn maps to locate as many of the buildings that I can find information about on historic Sanborn maps, and then I transpose them over the map of the contemporary city of Los Angeles. So yeah, so brick block, it kind of starts around, first in Los Angeles, and then it spreads in 2 directions. It spreads toward, and as it spreads, the Black community is kind of spreading. So the Robert Owens homestead was close to First in Los Angeles. Biddy Mason's homestead was on Spring Street between 3rd and 4th. But then she had property on Olvera Street and property on Broadway. She basically amassed enough money to build a 2-story building, which was her homestead on Spring between 3rd and 4th. I guess I should say, in addition, that the area in downtown was very ethnically diverse. So this is, in the 1800s. So California becomes a state in 1850. I think Biddy Mason wins her freedom in 1856 and is in Los Angeles and buying property in the 1860s. Slavery is abolished in the United States in 1865. And so this is when the community is kind of growing in this area, but at the same time, when California becomes a state, gold is discovered, and so Los Angeles becomes not just a settler town; it becomes a kind of gold rush prospector. So there are settlers and prospectors, and then also railroads being built. So there are people from all over. There are lots of immigrants from all over, like Europe as well as Asia, who are kind of building and prospecting and settling in this new city. And they're all downtown on top of each other. Yeah, so before we kind of migrate away from this area, so I mentioned 2 places. One was like the Mason block, and
Biddy Mason.
Yeah, so it's called the Mason block in the old maps, but Biddy Mason Place is where the Mason block was located, and then brick block, the business district. Okay, and so then in that area downtown on Los Angeles and First Street, kind of behind where Union Station is now, one of the old streets, it's kind of, Los Angeles has been extended as it crosses over First, but it used to have a different name. It used to be called Calle de los Negros before the American occupation, and then it became Nigger Alley after the American occupation. And it was an interesting street to find out about. In some maps, it's called one or the other, and it's actually not chronological, like it's not in terms of the year. So it's as if they, in Sanborn, maybe they at different points maybe took the name off and then they put the name back, but it's not that it was, I don't know, like looking at how the name appears, it's not as if it had a kind of pejorative name and people complained and then they cleaned it up, because it reoccurs again later. The pejorative. But basically there's a story about this street. So that street ended up, obviously there were some brown people who lived on the street at one point, but they could have been Californios, they could have been African Americans. They were people who had African descent in one way or another, but that area was largely immigrant. And so it ended up that Chinatown, the old Chinatown, developed right around that street. So in between the alley and Union Station was a kind of very small, like tenements and rooming houses, but largely Chinese. And in 1871, there was a kind of racial outbreak where I think 17 or 18 Chinese men, one young boy, were lynched on that street. Mm-hmm. So that incident caused, it was like a global incident. It was in newspapers globally, and it was an embarrassment to, the city of Los Angeles, to the townspeople who were very much trying to, just build a city and be seen as a progressive city. And so what happens over time is that the street basically gets erased. And so up until, the 20th century, where as part of the construction for Union Station, that's when the street becomes like fully erased. So first it's part of Chinatown, but Chinatown is essentially leveled for the expansion of the Civic Center and Union Station, and that street kind of goes along with it. So that's a third place that it's there now, but it's called Los Angeles Street, and it's kind of part of a roundabout to get to Union Station. So it doesn't really exist so much as a street anymore. And the area in between the street and Union Station is a kind of green, it's not a park, it's just like a green area in between roads. I don't know what the word for that is, but it's like part of the road.
Like a little grassy plot.
Yeah, it's a grassy plot in the road system. But it has this amazing history, like even just that it, all of the density of Chinatown that used to be there is just this grassy plot right now.
Wow.
Yeah. And so moving from there, I guess like kind of west and southwest into where the Little Tokyo area is. So the expansion of the Black community, Black inhabitants, and also the immigrants was along First Street, along Second Street, kind of up to Fifth, moving toward Alameda. And at that point, Central didn't exist. It had a different name. I'm not sure what it was called, but Biddy Mason and her son-in-law was Charles Owen. They pooled money together and provided funding for the first African Methodist Episcopal Church, FAME, which still exists. And that was on Azusa Street and San Pedro, near San Pedro. They started in someone's home, some of the other in the community in their home, and then they moved to this piece of property and opened this church. The church eventually moved to another location. So that part of downtown was Japanese and like Japanese American and African American, and other immigrants. And so they opened this church. I think it was before the turn of the century. And then when the church moved, the property was vacant for some time. And I don't remember exactly how, but the church changed hands, and it ended up that in around like 1915, a Black minister he travels from Wesleyan to Los Angeles to spread the gospel, but he is part of the apostolic faith, which is a religion kind of based in speaking in tongues. So it's the idea that the average person can have a kind of one-to-one spiritual relationship with God through speaking in tongues. And so this was very big in Wesleyan, the apostolic faith. And so he comes to Los Angeles and he basically breaks with the apostolic elders or whatever, and he starts he kind of puts his own spin on it, and he starts an interracial denomination of worshipers, and the church is open 24 hours a night, and he holds revivals, and it's called the Azusa Street Revival, and it becomes like really big in a very short period of time. It's, populated by immigrants and, just the people who are in downtown, but also those people travel back to where they came from, or they travel in missions to like spread the gospel. And so it's seen as being the birth of Pentecostalism. And it's on Azusa Street, which is Little Tokyo now. And it was started by this Black minister. He was a free person. He wasn't, he was born free, but I think he was first generation free. So there was a lot of kind of political wrangling as a result of him coming from the apostolic faith and breaking with them, also because he had an interracial congregation, which was very controversial at the time. So even though the Azusa Street Mission had a wide reach, and he had a printing press as well, and he had a falling out with someone in his mission, and she took the printing press, and that actually stopped, in a way, like it was very effective in cutting off his ability to reach a larger congregation. So the church started to shrink. It didn't last for that long in the form that it was.
Wow, it's like she banned his Twitter account.
Something like that, yeah. Yeah, right? He was effectively silent.
Cut off his communication.
Yeah. So that's, the first African Methodist Episcopal church, and then the Azusa Street Revival on Azusa Street. And then in the same area in Little Tokyo, like kind of moving, because that's like, 1915, 16, so it's early 20th century. Later in the 20th century, when World War II occurs and the Japanese Americans and Japanese nationals are sent to internment camps, that neighborhood becomes empty. The property is owned not by the Japanese, because there were actually laws that they couldn't own property. So they for the most part rented, but that property was just sitting there, and there were discussions and plans about basically how to generate rental income to replace what was lost with the internment of the Japanese. And I found these ads that were, I guess the landlords or developers had made ads geared toward Latin American communities. So they basically put, Spanish on top of the Japanese ads. And I guess it was some kind of campaign that they had, but I could never find out what happened to the campaign and why it didn't go forward. But it ended up that they rented to African Americans. And so the other context for this is defense production during the war, because California was essentially like an arm of defense. They were producing machinery, planes, boats. There was a lot of production and a lot of jobs. So it brought a lot of people. And in terms of the Great Migration, what's called the Great Migration of African Americans, many came to California at that period because of the jobs. And they landed in Bronzeville, this neighborhood. So Little Tokyo, vacant spaces were rented to African Americans. The African Americans there dubbed the neighborhood Bronzeville after Bronzeville in Chicago, which was a kind of well-known, thriving community, African American community in Chicago. And they had a kind of, well, because a lot of the people worked in the defense industry, and the defense industry was 24 hours, people had jobs at night as well as in the day. there's this phrase that I read about hotbed called hotbed, and hotbed was basically describing a living condition where people live in one apartment, but some people work in the day, and so they're there at night, and others work at night, so they're there in the day. So the idea that, you know, they're rotating the bed, the hot bed, that phrase encapsulates that. Part of my project is kind of finding phrases like that as well that describe phenomena of like a particular time. And so a lot of the dwelling was pretty compressed, and it was expensive for the people, and they were very compressed, and it wasn't, you know, such great living conditions. But because of this unique kind of intensity of people, 24-hour cycle, what happened was there a really thriving music scene that developed, so that, you know, people would go to clubs, and they had another phenomenon which was called breakfast clubs. So clubs that were open early in the morning, so that when people got off work, they would go to a nightclub, but in the morning.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and so of course there were people in the community who, you know, we're totally against this because it's night and you're supposed to be sleeping. You shouldn't be in the club or whatever. But it was just, you know, the way things developed. So this music scene is kind of like related to the birth of West Coast jazz. It's where bebop music is being played, and, you know, people like Charlie Parker, who kind of had his famous, there's this kind of famous scene where I think he's done drugs, and he, you know, is in a hotel, and he kind of comes out the hotel without clothes on. And that happened in downtown. I believe it was in the Civic Hotel, which is essentially in Little Tokyo now. So that's kind of like that part of downtown is really thriving in the period during the war. And then after the war is over, it ends. So a lot of people don't know about Bronzeville because it was, even though it was like a thriving neighborhood, it lasted just during the war period. And it lasted a little bit after, where African Americans and Japanese Americans and nationals were in the same place together. But for the most part, the Black settlement started to shift then along Central Avenue and kind of, you know, move, I guess it's west on Central Avenue. Yeah.
That is so interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, thank you for teaching me so much about this city I've lived in for 20 years. I'm a little embarrassed to.
No, but it's interesting because I think like these stories exist, but they're not actually put together. And so it seems like maybe people know of one part, but not, and the connections are really interesting. And so one of the things I hope from this project is just that it's not, you know, these dots that are not connected, but it starts being more readily connected. And I think also with Black settlement in Los Angeles, it has tended to be erased as, you know, history, as progress just kind of moves on. And yeah, so just recognizing what existed it's interesting, but it's also important.
Absolutely. And it is sad and frustrating to realize how much that history is based on, you know, racism and and injustice.
There's one last story I wanted
to
end with.
Please. Yeah.
I'm not sure if I exactly remember all the details. Well, it has to do with Robert Owens and the time before he came to Los Angeles, where he was in the mountains in Altadena, basically working and saving up money to buy his family out of slavery. Oh yeah, and so there's a canyon which is called El Preto Canyon, and it's part of a trail that exists now. And it's basically where he was kind of holed up. Well, it's kind of this area where renegades and, you know, rough people would just basically be in the woods and no one would bother them. And so he was there saving money, saving money before he brought his family to move to Los Angeles. So what's really interesting is that there is El Preto Canyon, and El Preto is the black one, and it's basically like where he lived.
Wow.
Yeah.
Gosh, I've learned so much through this conversation, and I actually feel like you've just kind of given me a taste of this incredible history in LA, and I want to learn more.
That's great. Yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Well, I only, in what I was doing, got to 1950, and I would really like to learn more about LA since then.
Yes.
Because there's a ton of stuff, since then.
So one question that I normally ask is whether events of the last year have affected any of these places, but it's a little different because you're already talking about places that are, historical places.
Right.
So,
right. I mean, I have to say, I visited Biddy Mason place during the George Floyd protests, but it was kind of an oasis. Like it's a very kind of quiet, pretty alley with trees. And so even though outside, the streets outside of it were quite chaotic, most people don't know it exists, so it wasn't really affected. But one of the things that I noticed being there, because I would, kind of walk and look, and it's a place where people are just moving from parking, right? Or going to Grand Central Market, or just, parking their car or whatever. So they don't necessarily look at what's there, but I did notice that the times that there were people looking, then other people looked too, which was, I think, nice. But yeah, I think that whole area, it was very much affected by the protests. Yeah, by first being kind of vandalized in some ways, but then also like with being boarded up, and just less people than in the past.
Yes, of course. Yeah. I mean, in a way, it seems fitting. I mean, a lot of the protests were, I know there was the vandalism component, but a lot of the protests were peaceful and powerful, and I think effective. And to have that happen in a location that has such a rich but also troubled history seems somehow fitting.
Yeah. Well, there were quite a few signs downtown that were, that said like Black-owned business or minority-owned business, and because I think it is an area that has like a representative of so many different groups even today.
LA is a very, I guess, diverse. Is that the right word?
Yeah,
I mean,
it's diverse. Yeah, it's diverse. And from what I've read, it's one of the most diverse, but also the most segregated.
Really?
Cities. Yeah, so it's both of those together. Yeah.
If you could ask one person about the 5 places that define LA for them, who would you like to ask?
Let's see. Well, I have 2 people.
Okay.
Can I say 2 people?
Absolutely.
Well, one is because the first person who came to mind is actually a film theorist who I think would have very interesting, kind of uncanny places, that come to mind. And his name is Akira Lippitt Mizuta, and he teaches at USC. And then the other person that comes to mind is Amy Murphy, who's
Oh,
also teaches at USC, but she's an
yes.
architect. And she's been also engaged in film, but we've had conversations about film in the city, and she has a really interesting project she's working on looking at actually race in the city through film. So both of them have a film angle, but I think they have very interesting locations that are meaningful to them that might be nice to share with an audience.
They both sound wonderful. I know Amy. In fact,
Okay.
she's on my list
Oh,
already.
she is. Okay.
Yes, because I think she's fascinating. But you see, I didn't realize she was working on this film project.
She's working on
Um,
a book actually about films,
oh, okay, okay.
the city and
Yeah,
film, but it's a book. Yeah.
wonderful. Well, those sound like two very fascinating people to interview. Yeah.
Well, it's really great to meet you, and I love, being involved in your project. Thank you.
Thank you so much for saying that. It's really such a pleasure to meet you. I've learned so much, and I am looking forward to learning more.
To learn more about Yolande's work and the people and places mentioned in this conversation, please check out the show notes. To hear more stories of the places that define Los Angeles, please subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. If you're enjoying the show, we would so appreciate if you would leave us a rating, a review, or share it with friends. We are a small, dedicated volunteer team, and every review and every rating helps keep the show going. Five Places is produced by Quinn Wynn, Monica Lamela, and me, Emmanuelle Bourlier, for the LA Forum for Architecture and Urban Design. We recorded on Chumash and Tongva land. Thank you for listening.